The morning mist clung to the prairie grass like forgotten dreams as Sarah stumbled through the endless expanse of Dakota territory. Her bare feet, cut and bleeding from days of walking on rough ground, left crimson traces on the dew-covered earth. The tattered remains of what had once been a blue cotton dress hung from her skeletal frame, offering little protection against the bitter October wind that swept across the plains. She had no memory of how she came to be walking alone across this desolate landscape. The last clear recollection she possessed was of sitting by a fireplace, though she couldn't remember whose fireplace it had been or even her own name. Everything before 3 days ago existed as fragmented images that slipped away like smoke whenever she tried to grasp them. A woman's voice calling, the smell of bread baking, strong hands lifting her. But these memories felt more like dreams than reality. Her stomach cramped with hunger, and her lips were cracked from thirst. The small creek she had found yesterday had run dry after only a few sips, and she had seen nothing but endless grass and sky since then. Ravens circled overhead, their harsh cries the only sound breaking the oppressive silence of the prairie. They seemed to be waiting, she thought dimly, though for what she didn't know. As the sun climbed higher, painting the grassland in shades of gold and amber, Sarah's steps became increasingly unsteady. Her vision blurred, and twice she fell to her knees, only to force herself upright through sheer will. She had to keep moving. Something deep in her bones told her that stopping meant dying, though she couldn't explain why this knowledge felt so certain. In the distance, a thin line of smoke rose straight up into the cloudless sky. Sarah blinked hard, certain it was a mirage born of desperation and exhaustion. But the smoke remained steady and real. With renewed energy born of hope, she changed direction and stumbled toward it, her feet finding strength they hadn't possessed moments before. The smoke led her to a small cabin nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees beside a clear running stream. The structure was modest but well-built, with thick log walls and a stone chimney from which the precious smoke continued to rise. A small garden plot showed the remains of a summer harvest, and several horses grazed peacefully in a makeshift corral nearby. Sarah approached cautiously, her instincts warning her to be careful even as her desperation drove her forward. She had learned during her days of wandering that being alone and vulnerable in this vast territory was dangerous, though she couldn't recall the specific lessons that had taught her this truth. As she drew closer to the cabin, the front door opened. A man stepped out onto the covered porch, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. He was tall and lean, with long black hair that hung past his shoulders and skin the color of burnished copper. 3 parallel scars ran from his left temple down to his jaw, giving his face a fierce appearance that made Sarah instinctively take a step backward. The man's dark eyes studied her with an intensity that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. He wore buckskin pants and a simple cotton shirt with moccasins on his feet that made no sound as he stepped down from a porch. A hunting knife hung at his belt, its leather handle worn smooth from use. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Sarah swayed on her feet, exhaustion and fear warring with desperate need. The man's expression revealed nothing of his thoughts, but his hand remained carefully away from his knife. She tried to speak, to ask for help or water or simply mercy, but her voice emerged as nothing more than a hoarse whisper. Then her legs gave out entirely. Sarah collapsed onto the hard ground, her vision tunneling to black spots as consciousness threatened to abandon her. She was dimly aware of rapid footsteps approaching, of strong arms lifting her with surprising gentleness. The man scent surrounded her as he carried her toward the cabin, leather and wood smoke, and something clean like pine sap. "Easy," he said, and his voice was deeper than she had expected, with an accent she couldn't place. "I have you." The interior of the cabin was simple but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a fire burning steadily in the grate. Simple wooden furniture filled the single room, a table and 2 chairs, a chest, and a narrow bed covered with blankets and buffalo hide. Herbs hung drying from the ceiling beams, filling the space with the earthy scents of sage and sweetgrass. The man laid her carefully on the bed, then moved to a shelf where several clay jars stood in neat rows. He selected one and returned with it and a tin cup filled with cool water from a bucket near the door. Drink slowly, he instructed, helping her sit up enough to sip from the cup. The water was the sweetest thing Sarah had ever tasted, though she obeyed his instruction and took only small amounts despite her body's demand for more. When she had managed several sips, he offered her a small piece of something that looked like dried meat mixed with berries. Pemmican, he explained. It will give you strength without making you sick. Sarah chewed the food slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. The scars that marked his left side were old, she realized, completely healed, but deep enough to suggest they had once been severe injuries. His manner was careful and controlled, as if he had learned to move through the world with deliberate precision. "What is your name?" he asked when she had finished eating. Sarah opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. The question seemed simple enough, but when she reached for the information, she found only emptiness. "I don't know," she whispered, and the admission felt like losing something precious. The man's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his dark eyes that might have been understanding. "Where did you come from?" Again, Sarah searched her fractured memory and found nothing useful. "I don't remember. I was walking. I've been walking for days, I think, but I don't know where I started or why." He was quiet for a moment, considering her words. Then he moved to the fireplace and ladled something from a pot that hung over the flames. The aroma of rabbit stew filled the air, making Sarah's stomach clench with renewed hunger. "My name is Joseph Running Bear," he said as he handed her a bowl of the stew. "This is my land." Sarah accepted the bowl gratefully, though her hands shook as she held the wooden spoon. "Thank you," she managed. "I'm sorry to impose on you. I didn't know where else to go." "You have nowhere to go," he observed. It wasn't a question. The simple statement hit her with unexpected force. She did have nowhere to go, no one to return to, nothing in her memory to guide her toward home or family or purpose. She was completely adrift in a world that felt familiar in some ways, but strange in others. "No," she admitted quietly. "I don't think I do." Joseph Running Bear sat in the chair across from the bed, his movements economical and precise. Everything about him suggested a man who had learned to live carefully, to waste nothing, and trust little. Yet he had taken her in without question, fed her without demanding explanations she couldn't give. "The scars," Sarah said suddenly, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. "What happened to you?" His hand moved unconsciously to his left cheek, tracing the marks that would forever mark him as different. "Bear attack," he said simply. 3 years ago, I was hunting alone and made a mistake. It must have been terrible." "It was educational," he replied, and there was something in his tone that suggested the experience had taught him lessons beyond the obvious ones about hunting and caution. As evening approached, Joseph prepared a simple meal of cornbread and venison, sharing it with Sarah without ceremony. She found herself studying his movements, noting how he seemed to anticipate her needs without being asked. When she grew cold, he added wood to the fire. When her water cup emptied, he refilled it without comment. "Why are you helping me?" she asked as darkness settled over the prairie. Joseph was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words were careful and measured. 3 years ago, after the bear attack, I walked for many days through country I didn't know. I was hurt and alone, and I had nowhere to go either. A family found me and took me in until I was strong enough to leave. They asked nothing from me except that I pass the kindness forward when I had the chance. Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, though she couldn't say if they were from gratitude or grief or simple exhaustion. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay you." "Repayment isn't the purpose," Joseph said. "Rest now. Tomorrow we can begin to figure out what comes next." As Sarah settled under the warm blankets, listening to the comforting sounds of Joseph banking the fire for the night, she realized that for the first time in days, she felt safe. She didn't know who she was or where she had come from, but in this small cabin with this scarred and careful man, she had found something she hadn't dared hope for: sanctuary. Outside, the wind howled across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of winter and the whispers of a world that held both danger and unexpected kindness. Sarah closed her eyes and let sleep take her, trusting for the first time since awakening on the plains that she would see another sunrise. The last thing she heard before sleep claimed her was the soft sound of Joseph's voice speaking words in a language she didn't understand, but somehow found comforting. Later, she would learn he was offering a prayer of gratitude for her safe arrival and asking for guidance in the days ahead. But for now, it was simply the sound of another human being acknowledging her presence in the world, and that was enough. Sarah woke to the sound of chopping wood and the rich aroma of coffee brewing over the fire. Sunlight streamed through the single window of the cabin, casting golden rectangles across the rough wooden floor. For a moment, she lay still, allowing herself to savor the luxury of warmth and safety before the weight of her circumstances settled over her again. She sat up carefully, testing her strength. The food and rest had helped considerably, though her body still ached from her days of wandering. Her feet, wrapped in clean cloth that Joseph must have tended while she slept, throbbed with each movement. The simple kindness of this care from a stranger brought tears to her eyes. Joseph entered the cabin carrying an armload of split wood, his hair tied back with a leather cord, and his shirt damp with sweat despite the morning chill. He glanced at her briefly, nodding when he saw she was awake, but made no comment about her tears. "There's coffee," he said, setting the wood beside the fireplace. "And I made cornmeal mush. It's plain but filling." Sarah swung her legs over the side of the bed, wincing as her injured feet touched the floor. "I should help. You've done too much already. You should rest," Joseph replied firmly. "Your feet need time to heal before you can do much walking." He brought her a cup of the strong black coffee and a bowl of the cornmeal porridge sweetened with wild honey. Sarah ate slowly, savoring each bite while studying Joseph's morning routine. He moved through his tasks with practiced efficiency, checking the fire, organizing his hunting gear, and preparing what looked like supplies for a day away from the cabin. "Are you leaving?" she asked, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. "I need to check my traps and hunt for fresh meat," Joseph explained. "I'll be back before dark. There's food here if you get hungry, and water in the bucket. Don't try to walk far on those feet." The thought of being alone again, even temporarily, filled Sarah with dread. She had grown accustomed to Joseph's quiet presence in the short time since he had found her, and the idea of his absence felt like losing her only anchor in a world that had become completely unfamiliar. "What if someone comes?" she asked. "What if I don't remember things that happened while you're gone?" Joseph paused in his preparations, studying her with those dark, assessing eyes. "Do you have reason to fear someone in particular?" Sarah searched her fragmented memory, looking for the source of her unease. Images flashed through her mind, angry voices, the sound of breaking glass, someone calling her name in desperation. But she couldn't connect them to specific people or events. "I don't know," she admitted. "I just feel like something terrible happened before I started walking. Something I should remember, but can't." Joseph was quiet for a moment, then moved to the wooden chest in the corner of the room. From it, he withdrew a small knife in a leather sheath, its blade sharp but manageable for someone unaccustomed to weapons. "Keep this with you," he said, placing it on the table within easy reach. "If anyone comes who makes you uncomfortable, hide in the root cellar behind the cabin. There's a wooden cover concealed by brush. Wait there until I return." The weight of the knife in her hands felt both foreign and familiar, as if she had once known how to use such a tool, but couldn't recall the learning of it. Sarah nodded, grateful for both the protection and the practical instruction. After Joseph left, Sarah spent the morning exploring the cabin's single room, hoping that familiar objects might trigger memories. Everything was meticulously organized and spotlessly clean. Joseph's few possessions were practical and well-maintained: cooking pots, hunting gear, a small collection of books, and bundles of dried herbs whose purposes she could only guess at. She found herself drawn to the books, running her fingers over their worn covers. Most were practical volumes, guides to hunting and trapping, a manual on treating injuries, a book about edible and medicinal plants. But tucked among them was a small, leather-bound journal filled with careful handwriting in English and what looked like symbols from another language entirely. Sarah opened the journal carefully, feeling like an intruder, but unable to resist the glimpse into Joseph's inner life. The entries were sparse and factual, recording weather conditions, game sightings, and the success of various hunts. But occasionally, longer passages revealed deeper thoughts. "The scars serve as a daily reminder that survival requires constant vigilance," read one entry. "I have learned to live with the knowledge that safety is always temporary, that the world is full of dangers both seen and unseen. But I have also learned that isolation, while safer, comes with its own cost. Sarah closed the journal quickly, ashamed of her invasion of Joseph's privacy, but struck by the loneliness evident in his words. She understood that feeling now, the weight of being completely alone in the world, untethered from any sense of belonging or purpose. As the day wore on, Sarah's strength gradually returned. She managed to tend the fire, adding wood when needed, and even prepared a simple meal of beans and dried meat for when Joseph returned. The domestic tasks felt natural to her hands, suggesting that she had once been responsible for such duties, though she couldn't remember where or for whom. In the afternoon, she discovered the root cellar Joseph had mentioned. Hidden behind the cabin and concealed by carefully arranged brush, the wooden cover opened to reveal a small but well-stocked storage space. Preserved vegetables, dried meat, and various supplies filled wooden shelves carved into the earth walls. It was clear that Joseph had prepared carefully for the isolation of prairie winters. As she climbed back out of the cellar, Sarah heard the sound of approaching horses. Her heart began to race, and she instinctively reached for the knife Joseph had left with her. But the sound was familiar somehow, and when she peered around the corner of the cabin, she saw Joseph returning with a successful hunt, 2 rabbits, and what looked like a sage hen tied to his saddle. "You've been busy," Joseph observed, noting the tidy cabin and the smell of cooking food. "I needed to be useful," Sarah replied. "I can't just lie in bed while you take care of everything." Joseph nodded approvingly as he cleaned his catch outside the cabin. Useful is good. Idle hands lead to troubled thoughts. As they prepared the evening meal together, Sarah found herself watching Joseph's scarred hands as he worked. The marks extended down his left arm as well, she realized, disappearing under his shirt sleeve. The bear attack had left him permanently marked inside and out. Yet he had chosen to help a stranger despite whatever lessons about human nature such an experience might have taught him. "Tell me about before," Sarah said as they sat down to eat. "Before the bear attack, what was your life like?" Joseph chewed thoughtfully before answering. "I lived with my tribe for the first 25 years of my life. We moved with the seasons, following the buffalo herds, and living as our ancestors had for generations beyond counting. It was a good life, but the world was changing around us. White settlers were claiming more land each year, and the government was pressuring tribes to move to reservations." He paused, staring into the fire as if seeing scenes from the past. "I left to scout new territory for our people, to find places where we might live in peace away from the conflict that were growing more frequent. That's when I encountered the bear. When I finally recovered from my injuries and returned to look for my people, I learned they had been forced onto a reservation in the Oklahoma Territory." "Why didn't you join them there?" "I tried," Joseph said quietly, "but reservation life was killing them slowly. Disease, starvation, despair, they were dying of being caged. I couldn't bear to watch it, and I couldn't stop it. So I left again and came here to this place where no one else wanted to live." Sarah felt the weight of his loss, understanding now why he had chosen such isolation. "Do you ever regret leaving them?" "Every day," Joseph admitted. "But regret and responsibility are different things. I couldn't save my people, but I can choose how to live with that failure." After dinner, as they sat by the fire, Sarah found herself sharing what fragments of memory she could access. Fleeting images of a town with dusty streets and wooden sidewalks. The sound of a church bell ringing. A woman's voice singing lullabies in a language that might have been German. None of it formed a complete picture, but speaking the memories aloud made them feel more real. "The mind has its own ways of healing," Joseph observed. "Sometimes forgetting is a mercy, even when we don't understand why. But how can I move forward if I don't know where I came from?" Sarah asked. "How can I make decisions about my future when I don't even know who I am?" "You are who you choose to be from this moment forward," Joseph replied. "The past shaped you, but it doesn't have to define you. Perhaps losing your memories is a gift, a chance to become whoever you truly want to be, free from expectations and obligations you didn't choose." That night, as Sarah lay in the darkness listening to the sounds of the prairie night, she considered Joseph's words. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps this blank slate was an opportunity rather than a tragedy. She had been given a chance to start over completely, to build a life based on her own choices rather than the circumstances of her forgotten past. But as sleep began to claim her, troubling dreams visited her rest. Shadowy figures pursuing her through endless corridors. the sound of screaming that might have been her own. A man's voice, harsh with anger, calling her names she couldn't quite hear. She woke several times, her heart pounding and sweat cooling on her skin despite the warmth of the cabin. In the morning, Joseph took one look at her and began preparing a special tea from some of the dried herbs hanging from the rafters. "Nightmares," he said, not making a question. "How did you know?" "You talked in your sleep." "Nothing clear, but enough to suggest your mind is trying to process things you can't consciously remember." Sarah sipped the bitter tea, finding it strangely soothing despite its harsh taste. "Do you think the memories will come back?" "Some will probably, but perhaps not all at once, and perhaps not in the way you expect. Healing happens in its own time." As the days passed, Sarah gradually took on more of the domestic responsibilities around the cabin. Her feet healed enough for short walks, and she began to explore the immediate area around Joseph's property. She discovered wild plants she somehow knew were edible, identified tracks left by various animals, and found herself falling into the rhythm of prairie life with surprising ease. Joseph began teaching her practical skills: how to preserve meat for winter storage, which plants could be used for medicine, how to read weather signs in the sky, and wind patterns. Sarah absorbed these lessons eagerly, grateful for knowledge that felt useful and immediate. "You learn quickly," Joseph observed one evening as Sarah successfully identified several medicinal herbs by scent alone. "These skills come naturally to you." "Maybe I lived somewhere similar before," Sarah mused. "Maybe that's why this life feels right to me." What she didn't say, what she was beginning to understand about herself, was that the isolation and simplicity of prairie life appealed to her in ways that suggested her previous existence had been complicated in unpleasant ways. The peace she felt here, the sense of rightness in this sparse but honest lifestyle, told her more about her character than any specific memory could. As autumn deepened into the promise of winter, Sarah realized she had stopped thinking constantly about her lost past. Instead, she found herself planning for the future, learning to tan hides, studying Joseph's maps of the territory, even discussing the possibility of expanding the garden next spring. Without noticing the transition, she had begun to think of the cabin as home and Joseph as family. The realization both comforted and frightened her. Was she abandoning her true identity, or finally discovering it? And what would happen when winter ended and the wider world intruded on their sanctuary once again? The first winter storm arrived with unexpected fury, howling across the prairie like a living thing bent on destruction. Sarah woke to Joseph shaking her shoulder gently, his face grim in the firelight. "Storm coming in fast," he said quietly. "We need to secure everything outside and bring in extra firewood. This one feels like it means to stay a while." Sarah dressed quickly, wrapping herself in the heavy wool coat Joseph had fashioned for her from buffalo hide and blanket wool. Outside, the wind already carried ice crystals that stung her exposed skin, and the sky had turned the particular gray-green color that meant serious weather was approaching. They worked together efficiently, bringing in armloads of firewood, securing the horse shelter, and checking that the root cellar was properly sealed. Joseph moved with the practiced urgency of someone who had weathered many prairie storms, but Sarah noticed a tension in his movements that suggested this storm felt different from the others. By mid-morning, the blizzard hit with full force. Snow fell so thickly that Sarah couldn't see the corral from the cabin window, and the wind drove against the log walls with a violence that made the entire structure shake. Joseph banked the fire carefully and checked their supplies of food and water, counting and recounting with the methodical precision of someone who understood that survival might depend on exact calculations. "How long do storms like this usually last?" Sarah asked, trying to keep worry out of her voice. "Hard to say," Joseph replied, settling in his chair with a piece of leather he was working into new moccasins. "I've seen them last 3 days. I've seen them last 2 weeks. The important thing is not to panic and not to make unnecessary trips outside." As the day wore on, the storm's intensity only increased. The wind created an endless symphony of howls and moans around the cabin, and occasionally something would strike the walls with enough force to make Sarah jump. She tried to keep busy with indoor tasks, mending clothes, organizing supplies, preparing meals, but the storm's constant assault made concentration difficult. It was during her third sleepless night of the blizzard that the memories began to return. Sarah woke from a dream that felt more real than the cabin around her. She had been standing in a church, wearing a white dress that was too tight in the bodice, while a man with cold eyes and rough hands waited for her at the altar. The congregation was full of people she recognized but couldn't name, all of them watching her with expressions of expectation and judgment. "I don't want to do this," she heard herself saying in the dream, but no one seemed to hear her protests. "You'll do as you're told," a woman's voice replied sharply. "You've caused enough trouble for this family already." Sarah sat up abruptly, her heart pounding and her nightgown soaked with sweat. The memory felt absolutely real, loaded with emotions that made her stomach churn with anxiety and dread. Across the room, Joseph stirred in his bedroll, but didn't wake. Over the following days, more memories surfaced in fragments. A man named Harold who drank too much and whose temper turned violent when challenged. A woman called Mother Beck who ran the household with rigid rules and harsh punishments. A town called Millfield where everyone knew everyone else's business and judgments were swift and unforgiving. The memories came without warning, triggered by ordinary activities. The smell of Joseph's coffee reminded her of standing in a kitchen while Mother Beck berated her for burning biscuits. The sound of wind against the cabin windows brought back the memory of cowering in a bedroom while Harold and another man argued violently in the room below. The feel of wool against her skin made her remember the scratchy gray dress she had been required to wear to church every Sunday, no matter how uncomfortable it made her. On the fourth day of the storm, as she was helping Joseph repair a piece of harness leather, Sarah's hands began to shake so violently she had to set down her work. "The man I was supposed to marry," she said suddenly, surprising herself at the words. "Harold Winters. He was Mother Beck's son, and she had decided we would wed whether I wanted to or not." Joseph looked up from his work, his expression carefully neutral. "Do you remember why you were living with this Mother Beck?" Sarah closed her eyes, searching the returning memories for that information. I think my parents died when I was young. Maybe in a fever epidemic? Mother Beck took me in, but not out of kindness. I was supposed to earn my keep through household work, and when I got old enough, I was supposed to marry Harold and continue being useful to the family. But you didn't want to marry him. Harold was cruel, Sarah said, the words feeling strange but true in her mouth. He hurt animals for pleasure, and he had a way of looking at women that made my skin crawl. Mother Beck said I was being foolish and ungrateful, that no one else would want a girl with no family and no money. She said I should be thankful Harold was willing to take me at all. As she spoke, more details came flooding back. Harold's drunken advances that became more aggressive as the wedding date approached. Mother Beck's increasingly harsh punishments when Sarah expressed reluctance about the marriage. The growing sense of desperation as Sarah realized no one in Millfield would help her avoid a fate she found increasingly terrifying. "What happened the night you left?" Joseph asked gently. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly, cold despite the warmth of the cabin. Harold came to the house drunk, drunker than usual. Mother Beck was visiting her sister, and he thought. She stopped, unable to voice what Harold had thought that night would happen. "He attacked you," Joseph said quietly. "He tried to. He said we were going to be married anyway. So what difference did it make if we anticipated the wedding night? When I fought him off, he became enraged. He said I was an ungrateful little whore who needed to learn her place." The memory was crystal clear now, playing out in Sarah's mind with horrible detail. Harold's hands tearing at her dress, his weight pinning her to the floor of Mother Beck's parlor. The desperate struggle that had ended when she managed to grab a poker from the fireplace and strike him across the head hard enough to knock him unconscious. "I thought I had killed him," Sarah whispered. "There was so much blood, and he wasn't moving. I was terrified that when he woke up, he would kill me for fighting back. So I ran." Joseph set down his leather work and moved to the chair beside her. "You did what you had to do to protect yourself. There's no shame in that. But I don't remember leaving Millfield or how I ended up walking across the prairie. There's still a gap between that night and when you found me." "Traumatic experiences can affect memory in strange ways," Joseph said. "Perhaps your mind protected you by blocking out the worst parts of your escape." Over the next few days, as the storm gradually exhausted itself, more pieces of Sarah's past fell into place. She remembered her real name, Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, and that she was 19 years old. She remembered that her parents had indeed died in a cholera outbreak when she was 12, and that Mother Beck had been a distant relative who took her in with the expectation that Sarah would eventually earn her keep through marriage to Harold. She remembered a life of constant criticism and punishment, of being told she was worthless and should be grateful for any scrap of kindness thrown her way. She remembered years of growing fear as Harold's interest in her became more obvious and predatory, and Mother Beck's increasing pressure for Sarah to accept his advances gracefully. But she also remembered small acts of rebellion that had kept her spirit alive. Stealing away to read books from the town library when Mother Beck thought she was at market. Teaching herself to identify edible plants during long walks that were supposed to be errands. Learning to move silently through the house to avoid unwanted attention from Harold. I wasn't completely helpless, Sarah realized one morning as she helped Joseph check on the horses after the storm finally passed. I've been planning to leave for months, learning skills I thought I might need. I just hadn't expected to have to run that particular night. You were preparing to save yourself, Joseph observed. That takes both courage and intelligence. As they dug out from the storm's aftermath, Sarah found herself viewing her recovered memories with a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief because she finally understood who she was and why she had been walking alone across the prairie. Sadness because the life she remembered held so little joy or kindness. Do you regret remembering? Joseph asked one evening as they sat by the fire. Sarah considered the question carefully. No, she said finally. Not knowing was worse than knowing something painful. At least now I understand why being here with you feels so much like freedom. What will you do now? Will you try to go back to Millfield? The question sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the winter cold. No, she said firmly. There's nothing for me there, but more of the same treatment I escaped from. Harold might be dead, but even if he's not, Mother Beck would never forgive me for running away, and the whole town would know what I did. Then you'll stay here? Sarah looked around the small cabin that had become more home to her than any place she could remember. If you'll have me, I know this isn't what you planned when you took in a lost stranger. Joseph was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When I first came to this place, I thought I wanted complete solitude. I thought isolation would protect me from further pain. But this winter, having someone to share the work and the silence with, it's made me realize that safety and loneliness aren't the same thing. Are you saying you'd like me to stay? I'm saying that if you choose to stay, you wouldn't be in imposition. You become, he paused, searching for the right words. You become part of how I imagine my life continuing. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude rather than sadness. For the first time in her remembered life, someone was asking her what she wanted rather than telling her what she should want. Then, I'll stay, she said simply. As winter deepened and the days grew shorter, Sarah and Joseph settled into the rhythm of shared domestic life. They developed their own traditions and routines, working together with an efficiency born of growing familiarity and trust. Sarah learned to read the subtle changes in Joseph's expression that indicated his moods, while he learned that she needed time alone each morning to process her thoughts before beginning the day's activities. The nightmares that had plagued Sarah since her memories began returning gradually became less frequent and intense. Joseph showed her techniques his grandmother had taught him for managing troubling dreams, herbal teas, meditation practices, and ways of reframing traumatic memories that reduce their power to cause ongoing distress. Healing doesn't mean forgetting, Joseph explained one night after Sarah woke from a dream about Harold. It means learning to carry difficult experiences without letting them control your present choices. As the year turned and the worst of winter began to ease, Sarah realized she had changed in ways that went beyond simply recovering her memories. Living with Joseph had taught her that relationships could be based on mutual respect rather than power and control. She had learned that her opinions and preferences mattered, that she could contribute meaningfully to someone else's life while maintaining her own sense of identity. Most importantly, she had learned that survival wasn't just about enduring hardship. It was about creating something worthwhile from whatever circumstances life presented. But as spring approached and the isolation of winter began to lift, both Sarah and Joseph knew that their sanctuary couldn't remain completely separate from the wider world forever. Traders would come through with the warm weather, and travelers would pass by their remote cabin. Eventually, someone from Sarah's past might come looking for her. The question was whether the strength they had built together during the dark months would be enough to face whatever challenges the outside world might bring. Spring arrived with a rush of melting snow and mud that transformed the prairie landscape from stark white to rich brown overnight. Sarah stood at the cabin window, watching water cascade down from the roof in steady streams, forming temporary rivers that would disappear as soon as the ground could absorb the winter's accumulated moisture. "It's beautiful," she said, marveling at how different the world looked with the promise of new growth beginning to emerge. Joseph joined her at the window, carrying 2 cups of the mint tea they had learned to make from plants Sarah had found and dried the previous autumn. "Spring here happens fast," he observed. "One day you're wondering if winter will ever end, and the next day you're planning what to plant in the garden." They had spent many winter evenings planning improvements to their small homestead. Joseph had sketched out ideas for expanding the garden, building a proper chicken coop, and adding a room to the cabin. Sarah had compiled lists of seeds to acquire, preserving techniques to try, and household improvements that would make their life more comfortable. But now, with spring's arrival imminent, both of them felt the underlying tension of knowing their isolation was about to end. The trading post at Crow Creek would be opening soon, and with it would come the first contact they had had with other people since Sarah's arrival. "Are you nervous about seeing other people again?" Joseph asked, settling into his chair to work on a new pair of moccasins he was making for Sarah. "Yes," Sarah admitted. "I've gotten so used to our quiet life here. The thought of having to explain who I am or answer questions about my past feels overwhelming." "We don't have to tell anyone anything beyond what's necessary for trading," Joseph pointed out. "You're my wife as far as anyone else needs to know." The casual way he said it made Sarah's breath catch. They had never discussed the exact nature of their relationship, though it had evolved far beyond host and grateful guest during the long winter months. They shared domestic duties, made decisions together, and had developed an intimacy based on trust and mutual understanding. But Joseph had never presumed anything beyond friendship, always giving Sarah her own space and never making demands on her affection. "Your wife?" she asked quietly. Joseph looked up from his work, meeting her eyes directly. "If that's what you want to be, we could make it official when the circuit preacher comes through. Or we could simply live as we have been and let people assume what they will." Sarah felt her heart begin to race. The idea of marriage terrified her after her experiences with Harold and Mother Beck, but the thought of binding herself to Joseph felt entirely different. He had proven over and over again that he valued her as a person, that he would protect her, but not control her, that he saw marriage as a partnership rather than ownership. "I want to think about it," she said finally. "Of course," Joseph replied, returning to his stitching with no sign of disappointment or pressure. "There's no rush to decide anything." 3 days later, the first traders of the season arrived. Sarah heard the sound of approaching wagons and immediately felt her stomach clench with anxiety. She had known this moment would come, but the reality of facing strangers felt more difficult than she had anticipated. "Stay inside if you prefer," Joseph said, reading her expression. "I can handle whatever trading we need to do." But Sarah forced herself to shake her head. "No, I need to learn to be around other people again. I can't hide forever." The trading party consisted of 3 men with 2 heavily loaded wagons, the Murphy brothers, who ran a circuit between several remote settlements and homesteads. They were weathered, practical men who seemed more interested in conducting business efficiently than in gossiping about their customers' personal lives. Joseph called the eldest brother Tom Murphy as he climbed down from his wagon seat. "Good to see you made it through another winter. We heard it was a hard one." "Hard enough," Joseph replied, shaking hands with each of the brothers. "But we managed fine." Sarah noticed how naturally Joseph said "we," and how the traders didn't seem surprised to learn he had someone sharing his cabin. Apparently, it wasn't unusual for isolated homesteaders to take in partners or spouses between trading seasons. "Ma'am," Tom Murphy said, touching his hat when Joseph introduced Sarah simply as "My Sarah." "Pleasure to meet you. Hope you didn't find the prairie winter too harsh." "It was quite an adjustment," Sarah said carefully, "but I learned to appreciate the peace and quiet." The Murphy brothers spent several hours examining Joseph's furs and hides, negotiating prices, and showing their trade goods. Sarah found herself drawn to the bolts of fabric, needles, and thread and small luxuries like real coffee and white sugar that had been impossible to obtain during the winter. "Haven't seen you before, ma'am," said the youngest brother, Pete, as Sarah examined a length of blue cotton fabric. "You new to the territory?" Sarah felt Joseph tense beside her, ready to intervene if the questions became uncomfortable. But she found that she could handle this level of casual curiosity without panic. "Fairly new," she said smoothly. "I came here for back east last fall. Long way to travel," Pete observed. "Hope you're settling in well." "Very well, thank you." When the traders finally departed, Sarah realized she felt proud of herself for handling the interaction successfully. She had managed to be pleasant and normal without revealing anything about her past that she didn't want to share. "You did well," Joseph said as they watched the wagons disappear into the distance. "It felt good to talk to other people without being afraid," Sarah admitted. "Though I'm glad they're gone, and we have our privacy back." But their privacy was not destined to last long. A week later, a lone rider approached the cabin just as Sarah was hanging laundry outside to dry. Something about the man's posture and the purposeful way he rode made her immediately uneasy. "Joseph," she called, not taking her eyes off the approaching stranger. Joseph emerged from the cabin, his rifle held casually but ready. He had learned to be cautious about unexpected visitors, especially ones who rode with the kind of determination this man displayed. The rider was a heavy-set man in his 40s, wearing clothes that marked him as a town dweller rather than a frontiersman. His face was flushed from hard riding, and his eyes held an intensity that made Sarah's skin crawl with recognition even before he spoke. "You Harold Winters?" Joseph called out when the man was still 20 yards away. "Name's Deputy Marshal Collins," the man replied, pulling his horse to a stop. "I'm looking for a woman who might have passed through this area." Young woman, about 20 years old, brown hair, goes by the name Sarah Morrison. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Somehow, impossibly, someone from Millfield had tracked her to this remote place. She took an involuntary step backward, every instinct screaming at her to run. "What's your business with this woman?" Joseph asked, his voice carefully neutral. "She's wanted for questioning in connection with a serious assault," Collins replied. "A fellow named Harold Winters was found beaten near to death in his home last October. Before he lost consciousness, he managed to tell folks it was Sarah Morrison who attacked him." "Did he say why she might have attacked him?" Joseph's voice remained steady, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. "Claimed she was trying to rob the place," Collins said. "But between you and me, there's talk in town that the girl had been acting strange for weeks before the incident. Some folks think she might not be right in the head." Sarah felt a surge of rage, so pure it surprised her. Even now, even when she wasn't there to defend herself, Harold was controlling the narrative and making himself the victim. The idea that anyone would believe she had tried to rob Mother Beck's house was absurd, but she realized that Harold's version of events would be much more acceptable to the townspeople than the truth about his attempted assault. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description," Joseph said firmly. "This is pretty isolated country. A young woman traveling alone wouldn't be likely to make it very far out here." Collins studied Joseph's face carefully, clearly trying to determine if he was lying. "You're sure about that?" "Harold Winters is offering a substantial reward for information leading to her capture." "I'm sure," Joseph replied. "But I'll keep an eye out and let you know if anyone like that shows up." Collins nodded slowly, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "Much obliged. Mind if I water my horse before I head back?" "Help yourself," Joseph said, gesturing toward the stream. While Collins tended to his horse, Sarah remained frozen by the cabin door, terrified that any movement might draw his attention. She watched as the deputy marshal's eyes swept over their small homestead, taking in the domestic details that suggested a settled life rather than a temporary hideout. "Nice place you got here," Collins said as he prepared to remount. "Must get lonely, though, being so far from civilization." "Some folks prefer it that way," Joseph replied. After Collins rode away, Sarah collapsed onto the cabin's front step, her legs too shaky to support her. The brief encounter had brought back all the fear and helplessness she had felt during her last days in Millfield. "He knows I'm here," she said when she could finally speak. "Maybe not for certain, but he suspects." Joseph sat down beside her, setting his rifle within easy reach. "Even if he suspects, he can't prove anything, and he's not likely to come back without more evidence. But what if Harold recovers enough to give a better description? What if someone else remembers seeing me leave town? Then we'll deal with that when it happens," Joseph said calmly. Running away again won't solve anything. This is your home now, and I won't let anyone take you away from it. Sarah felt tears of gratitude and fear warring in her eyes. I don't want to bring trouble to your life. Maybe I should leave before. No, Joseph said firmly. You're not responsible for Harold's lies, and you're not going to sacrifice your safety to protect mine. We faced this together. That evening, as they sat by the fire discussing their options, Sarah found herself thinking about the deputy's visit in a new light. For the first time since recovering her memories, she felt angry rather than simply afraid. Harold had not only tried to assault her, but he was now using the legal system to continue his persecution even from his sickbed. I'm tired of being afraid of him, she said suddenly. For years, I let Mother Beck and Harold control my life through fear. I won't do that anymore. Joseph looked up from a map he was studying. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that if Collins comes back, I want to tell him the truth about what happened that night. Harold tried to force himself on me, and I defended myself. If anyone should be facing legal consequences, it's him. That's a brave thought, Joseph said carefully. But you have to understand that in a situation like this, it would be your word against Harold's. And Harold has the advantage of being the injured party and a respected member of the community. Sarah knew Joseph was right, but the injustice of it made her furious. So I'm supposed to spend the rest of my life hiding and running because Harold Winters is a liar and a predator? You're supposed to stay alive and free, Joseph replied. Sometimes that means making choices that feel unfair. As spring progressed into early summer, Sarah found herself constantly listening for the sound of approaching riders. Every unexpected noise made her heart race, and she began having nightmares again about being dragged back to Millfield to face Harold's accusations. But gradually, as weeks passed without another visit from Deputy Collins or anyone else, Sarah began to relax. Perhaps Harold's injuries had been more serious than Collins had indicated. Perhaps the deputy had decided the reward wasn't worth pursuing a lead this far from town. Perhaps the whole matter would simply fade away as other concerns occupied Millfield's attention. It was this growing sense of security that made the second visit, when it finally came, so much more devastating than the first. This time, Collins didn't come alone. He brought Harold Winters himself, along with a federal marshal and papers that claimed legal authority to search Joseph's property and arrest Sarah if she was found there. Sarah saw them coming from the garden where she was working and knew immediately that their peaceful life was over. Harold sat slumped in his saddle, his head wrapped in bandages and his face bearing the kind of permanent damage that came from severe head trauma. But his eyes, when they fixed on Sarah across the distance, burned with hatred and determination. Run, Joseph said quietly, appearing beside her with his rifle. Take the horse and ride toward Crow Creek. I'll delay them as long as I can. But Sarah found that her legs wouldn't move. After months of building a life based on honesty and courage, the thought of running again felt like a betrayal of everything she had become. No, she said, straightening her shoulders and walking toward the approaching riders. I'm done running. Sarah walked steadily toward the approaching riders, her heart pounding, but her steps sure. Behind her, she could hear Joseph's quiet footfalls as he followed, his rifle held ready but not threatening. The morning sun cast long shadows across the prairie grass, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang, as if this were any ordinary day. When the riders were close enough for conversation, Sarah stopped and waited, forcing herself to stand straight and meet Harold's damaged gaze without flinching. The months of living with Joseph had changed her in ways that went deeper than recovered memories. She had learned what it felt like to be valued and respected, and that knowledge had given her a strength she hadn't possessed when she fled Millfield. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison called the federal marshal, a thin man with steel-gray hair and cold eyes. You're under arrest for assault with intent to commit murder. Marshal Webb, Sarah said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. I assume Deputy Collins told you he found me here. Actually, Webb replied, dismounting from his horse. It was Mr. Winters who identified this location. Seems he remembered some things about the night you attacked him. Sarah glanced at Harold, noting the way his hands shook as he held the reins, and the difficulty he seemed to be having focusing his eyes. The head injury had clearly left him with lasting damage, but it had apparently not affected his determination to see her punished. I'm curious what Mr. Winters claims to remember, Sarah said carefully, since he was unconscious when I left Millfield. Harold tried to speak, but his words came out slurred and difficult to understand. Deputy Collins moved his horse closer and spoke for him. Mr. Winters says you came to his mother's house that night, specifically to rob them. He says when he tried to stop you, you attacked him with a fireplace poker and left him for dead. That's interesting, Sarah replied. What does he claim I was trying to steal? Collins looked uncertain for a moment, clearly not having anticipated that question. Household goods, money, whatever you could carry. Did anyone check to see if anything was actually missing from the house? The silence that followed her question told Sarah everything she needed to know. No one had bothered to verify Harold's story because no one had wanted to consider any alternative explanation for what had happened. The facts are simple. Marshall Webb interjected impatiently. You assaulted a man and fled. Whether you actually stole anything is beside the point. The facts are not simple, Joseph said quietly, speaking for the first time since the riders had arrived. And the truth matters, even when it's inconvenient. Webb turned his attention to Joseph with obvious irritation. This doesn't concern you, Indian. Stay out of it. Actually, Sarah said, stepping forward slightly. It concerns him very much. Joseph Running Bear is my husband, and anything that affects me affects him as well. The declaration surprised everyone present, including Joseph, though he was careful not to show it. Sarah had made the decision in that moment, realizing that claiming the protection of marriage might give her legal standing she wouldn't have as an unmarried woman. Your husband? Collins asked skeptically. You got married out here? Circuit preacher came through in March, Joseph said smoothly, supporting Sarah's improvisation. Legally performed and properly witnessed. Sarah felt a rush of gratitude for Joseph's quick thinking, though she noticed Harold's face contorting with rage at the news. Whatever his fantasies about her eventual fate, they clearly hadn't included her finding happiness with another man. That still doesn't change the fact that she's wanted for a serious crime, Webb said. Marriage doesn't grant immunity from the law. No, Sarah agreed, but it does give me the right to have my husband present during any questioning, and it gives him the right to speak on my behalf. Webb looked annoyed, but didn't dispute her claim. In the territories, where legal proceedings were often informal and improvised, the rights of married couples were generally respected, even when other legal niceties were overlooked. Fine, Webb said. We'll do this properly. Sarah Morrison, or whatever you're calling yourself now, you're accused of assault with intent to commit murder against Harold Winters on the night of October 15th. How do you answer these charges? Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would determine the course of her entire future. I plead not guilty, Marshall Webb. I acted in self-defense against an attempted assault. Harold made a sound of outrage that came out as an unintelligible gargle. Collins leaned down to listen to him, then straightened with a troubled expression. Mr. Winters says that's a lie. He says he was trying to prevent you from robbing his mother's house. Then, perhaps Mr. Winters can explain why I was found in the parlor wearing only a torn nightgown, Sarah said, meeting his eyes steadily. And perhaps he can explain why there were no household goods missing from the house, despite this alleged robbery attempt. For the first time, Collins looked uncertain. You were in a nightgown? I was staying as a guest in Mother Beck's house, Sarah explained. I had been living there for 7 years, since my parents died. I was in my nightclothes because it was late evening, and I was preparing for bed when Harold arrived, heavily intoxicated. That still doesn't explain why you attacked him, Webb said, though his tone had become less certain. Sarah felt Joseph's presence behind her like a source of strength. She thought about all the conversations they had shared during the winter, about the courage he had shown in leaving his tribe to scout new territory, about the way he had rebuilt his life after losing everything that mattered to him. Marshall Webb, she said clearly, Harold Winters tried to rape me. When I fought him off, he became violent and threatened to kill me. I defended myself with the only weapon I could reach. If he had succeeded in his assault, I doubt anyone would have cared enough to investigate my complaints. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Harold made another strangled sound of protest, but Sarah noticed that Collins was no longer translating his attempted words. Instead, the deputy was studying Harold with a new expression, one that suggested he was beginning to see the injured man in a different light. Those are serious accusations, Webb said slowly. Yes, they are, Sarah agreed. And they're true. Ask anyone in Millfield about Harold's reputation with women. Ask them about his drinking and his temper. Asked them why Mother Beck was so eager to marry me off to him despite my obvious reluctance. Even if what you're saying is true, Webb said carefully, you still injured a man severely and fled without reporting the incident to the authorities. Who would I have reported it to? Sarah asked. Harold's uncle is the sheriff in Millfield. His cousin runs the general store. His family practically owns the town. Who exactly would have believed the word of an orphan girl against Harold Winters? Joseph stepped forward slightly, adding his voice to Sarah's defense. She came here injured and traumatized, with no memory of how she had escaped from wherever she had been. It took months for her to recover enough to remember what had happened to her. That's convenient, Webb said skeptically. It's the truth, Joseph replied firmly. I've seen the nightmares. I've watched her struggle with fragments of memory that made no sense until they finally came together into a complete picture. No one could fake that kind of psychological trauma. Collins was studying Harold again, and Sarah could see wheels turning behind the deputy's eyes. Mr. Winters, he said slowly, is it true that your uncle is Sheriff Winters? Harold nodded, apparently not understanding where the question was leading. And your family does have significant influence in Millfield? Another nod, this one more uncertain. Collins turned to Webb with a troubled expression. Marshal, I'm beginning to wonder if we've heard the whole story about this case. Webb was clearly annoyed by the turn the conversation was taking. The man was nearly killed. Someone has to answer for that. But if he was attempting to commit a serious crime when he was injured, Collins said carefully, then the person who injured him might have been justified in their actions. Sarah felt a surge of hope. Deputy Collins might not be completely sympathetic to her situation, but he seemed to be an honest man who was beginning to understand that the case wasn't as straightforward as Harold had presented it. There's another issue, Joseph said quietly. Even if you arrest Sarah and take her back to Millfield, what kind of fair trial do you think she'll get in a town where the victim's family controls the legal system? Webb opened his mouth to respond and closed it again. The question of fair treatment for defendants was a sensitive issue in the territories, where local politics and family connections often influenced legal proceedings. What do you suggest? Webb asked finally. I suggest you investigate the case more thoroughly before making any arrests, Joseph replied. Talk to people in Millfield who aren't related to Harold. Find out what Sarah's life was like in that house. Ask questions about Harold's character and behavior. And, in the meantime, she stays here. She stays here, Joseph confirmed, as a married woman on her husband's property, under my protection and responsibility. Harold made another attempt at speech, his face flushed with effort and rage. This time Collins leaned down to listen more carefully. He's saying something about the marriage being illegal, Collins reported. Something about you not having the right to marry without permission. Whose permission? Sarah asked sharply. I'm 19 years old and have no living family. Under territorial law, I have the right to marry whomever I choose. He seems to think Mother Beck had some kind of legal guardianship over you, Collins said. Sarah felt her temper flare. Mother Beck had no legal authority over me beyond what I allowed her to have out of gratitude for taking me in. She was a distant relative who provided me with room and board in exchange for household labor. That didn't give her the right to dispose of me in marriage like a piece of property. Webb was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Sarah could see that he was beginning to understand that the case he had thought was simple assault might actually involve questions of women's rights, family authority, and sexual violence that would be much more difficult to prosecute. I need to think about this, Webb said finally. This isn't the straightforward case I was led to believe it was. Take all the time you need, Joseph said. But while you're thinking, remember that Sarah has already suffered months of trauma and fear because of Harold's accusations. She deserves to have the truth heard, not just his version of it. As the three men prepared to leave, Collins approached Sarah with something that might have been an apology in his expression. Ma'am, he said quietly, I want you to know that if things had been presented to me differently from the beginning, I might have asked different questions. Thank you, Sarah replied. That means more to me than you might imagine. After the riders disappeared into the distance, Sarah and Joseph stood together in the sudden silence of their prairie home. Sarah felt drained but also strangely exhilarated. For the first time in her life, she had stood up to authority and demanded to be heard. Did I really just claim to be married to you in front of a federal marshal? She asked. You did, Joseph replied, a slight smile playing around his lips. I hope you don't mind that I didn't correct you. I was hoping you wouldn't, Sarah admitted. Though I suppose we should probably make it legal before Marshall Webb comes back. Is that a proposal? Sarah turned to face Joseph fully, studying the scars that marked his face and the quiet strength that had made her feel safe for the first time in her adult life. It's a proposal, she said simply. If you'll have a wife who comes with legal troubles and a complicated past. Joseph reached out to take her hands, his calloused fingers warm and steady against her skin. I can't think of anything I'd want more. 3 weeks later, when the circuit preacher finally arrived for his summer rounds, Sarah Elizabeth Morrison became Sarah Elizabeth Running Bear in a simple ceremony witnessed by 2 traveling traders and blessed by the vast sky of the Dakota Prairie. Marshall Webb never returned to arrest her. Word came through the trading networks that Harold's uncle, Sheriff Winters, had been quietly relieved of his duties following an investigation into several cases of questionable arrests involving young women. Harold himself had been moved to a facility for people with serious head injuries, where his ability to make accusations against anyone was severely limited. As summer gave way to autumn and their first anniversary as a couple approached, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this place of peace and purpose. She had lost her memory and found herself. She had fled from one life and built another. She had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act rightly despite being afraid. Standing in the garden she had planned and planted with Joseph, watching the sunset paint the prairie grass gold and crimson, Sarah understood that home wasn't a place you were born to or a family you inherited. Home was something you built with someone who valued you, something you protected by being willing to stand up for what was right. The scars of her past would always be with her, just as Joseph's bare scars would always mark his face. But scars, she had learned, were evidence of survival, proof that you could endure terrible things and still find a way to live fully. As Joseph emerged from the cabin carrying 2 cups of coffee to share while they watched the day end, Sarah smiled and reached for his hand. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys, but tonight they were home, they were safe, and they were together. It was enough. It was everything.